So you need to write a philosophy paper. Philosophy papers are arguments that try to persuade a reader of a particular point of view. So your main job is to convince the reader of something and not just summarize the course material. The purpose of this video is to give you some tips on doing that job well. Tips on how to write a philosophy paper. We will discuss 12 tips broken up into big picture, detail and style, structure, things philosophers tend to value, and what happens when you're stuck. Let's get started. Big picture. Have a takeaway. Does your paper have a takeaway? After reading your paper, what do you want the reader to think in a sentence? You might not be able to articulate this when you first start writing your paper, but it will come hopefully after a draft or two. Generally, philosophy papers involve this kind of a format. Main claim, sometimes called a thesis, the background or setup to understand that claim, and the argument that follows, the argument, which is the evidence for that main claim. Try to get the takeaway, the main claim, down into a concise statement. So for example, from student essays, I've seen something like this. I will refute design arguments for the existence of God by showing that they trade on an ambiguity. In this essay, I claim that metaphysical possibility does not track logical possibility. It's important here not to sit on the fence. Make a claim. Don't just say, well, there are good points on side A and there are good points on side B. If you've done your job well, you will have come down on one of those sides and persuaded the reader. Give an argument for your main claim. Your argument is the reasons, evidence, examples, remarks that support your main claim. You might lay this out in a stepwise argument, i.e. numbered premises and a conclusion, or it might go in just free-flowing prose form. Include background material. This material may include the exposition of a theory, an exposition of a philosopher's view or problem, the definition of key terms and principles. So for example, if you're arguing against a particular version of the design argument, you will need to lay out that argument for the reader. So this is a good place to define your terms. A good background, a good exposition shows significance, shows the reader why this background material matters. Detail and style. Recycle terms and phrases. Use one term or phrase to mean one thing. When you return to it, that thing, recycle that term or phrase. Suppose you're writing about free will. Just use the term free will, explain what it means, and when you come back, just say the word free will again. Don't reach for freedom, free acts, free soul. You'll confuse the reader. Here is an example from a student's essay. They begin the essay by saying, an addict might believe they have free will. And in the next paragraph, they say, addicts often believe they have freedom. The reader is left wondering if there is something deep going on. Is there a distinction that the student is trying to draw the reader's attention to between free will and freedom? You might have heard the advice that to keep your writing fresh and interesting, you should vary your word choice. In philosophy, this can end up in confusion, because philosophers often take care to draw distinctions and define their terms. The reader might think that you're drawing a distinction, for example, between free will and freedom. Use simple sentences and connect them. If you think that Nussbaum's capacity approach is coherent, just go ahead and say, I think Nussbaum's capacity approach is coherent. Moreover, it's important to connect your sentences. Common connecting words and phrases do philosophical work in your papers. So for example, they can draw a conclusion. Thus, therefore, so. They can give reasons. A reason to agree with X is because, since. They can draw implications. This implies, this suggests that. If one agrees that A, one should also agree that B, because. They can distinguish between different concepts and ideas, fence off one concept from another. In contrast, alternatively, instead. These phrases, note, do philosophical work. They draw conclusions, give reasons, draw implications, and draw distinctions. So don't just throw these words around throughout your paper, because the reader might think that you're trying to do some philosophical work with them. Be careful of fancy words and generalisations. Since philosophy deals with big ideas like what exists, distinctions between right and wrong, our place in the world, and the nature of thought, some students reach for fancy sounding terms and phrases and tend to generalise too greatly. Fancy sounding words. So, for example, every year I'll get an essay or two that says, "This begs the question," when the student really means, "This raises the question." This begs the question sounds impressive, it sounds fancy, but the problem is it has a technical meaning. It means to assume what we're trying to prove in our premises. So, for example, I'm confident that God exists because it says so in the Bible, and the Bible contains God's word. Well, here the person arguing for God assumes that God already exists in order to prove God's existence. If you're not sure what these terms mean, the best course of action is just to avoid philosophical jargon. I also get this kind of a generalization every year. All philosophers think X, Y, and Z. Well, I'm pretty sure that you haven't read all philosophers, so it's going to be hard for you to prove this claim. If we use all and always, we can get ourselves into errors this way, and we can make our life more difficult. So, for example, saying water always boils at 100 degrees C, well, this is just factually incorrect because water boils at different temperatures relative to pressure. Or take this from a student's essay. All humans think in terms of beliefs and desires. Well, now the student has their work cut out for them to prove that humans all indeed do think in terms of beliefs and desires. So be careful when you generalize. You might have heard that using examples is an important part of writing. But in philosophy, I think this is especially the case because we are dealing with abstract ideas. Examples can render these abstract ideas concrete and vivid. So try to help the reader understand your ideas by giving them examples. If you want to keep your philosophical writing interesting and fresh, this is a good place to look. So, for example, take Clifford's evidentialist principle. It's wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. The idea is that our justified beliefs always depend on us having sufficient reasons or evidence. So to illuminate this principle, take this example. Suppose a pilot lacks sufficient evidence that their plane is safe to fly. They have not inspected the outside of the plane, spoken to the technical crew, or inspected their instruments. For Clifford, the pilot is always wrong to believe that the plane is safe to fly without sufficient evidence. See how the example illuminates the principle. We've looked at big picture, detail and style, and now let's look at structure. Structure. Write an anti-detective story. In a detective story, we find out who did the crime at the end. In a philosophy paper, we want to write the anti-detective story that tells the reader up front at the beginning what the main claim is. We often start out writing, and then by the time we get to the end of our paper, we've worked out what we want to say. The end result is this detective story. We get on the last page of a student's paper the main claim, or even worse, in the last line. This is natural. Writing is often a process through which we work through our ideas. But you don't want to present this as your final paper. Instead, in your final paper, or version of the paper, make your claim up front and defend it. Drafts here will be important because writing drafts will give the opportunity to work through what you're wanting to say. Try to put the main claim at the beginning of your paper. So your introduction should state your main claim, summarize how you're going to argue for it, and your conclusion should restate your main claim and restate or recap how you argued for it. Sometimes a useful thing to do is return to the first line of the paper in your conclusion. Signpost and write an outline. Often students have great ideas, but they struggle to put a structure around it. Considering the macro level signposting can give structure to your ideas, give it an outline. Now, you might do this with section headings. These will act as a checklist both for you and the reader as you go through the reading or writing process. You might try something like this: the problem, 2 solutions, a novel approach. Imagine you're writing about evidentialism. Well, then your sections might be evidentialism, evidentialism's critics, why we should still be evidentialists. Sections do not need to be equal length. If you can say what you need to say in a paragraph, just make that section 1 paragraph. At the micro level, we are attributing ideas and claims to various people and positions. So, for example, one might write, according to Hack, if we follow Chalmers. Nietzsche claims that. Anscombe holds that. Wollstonecraft offers 3 main objections. You can also self-attribute. Don't be afraid to use the first person pronoun, I. Try on language like this. I claim that. I will offer 3 remarks in support of my view. I will provide 2 examples. I will show that. At the intermediate level, signposting is telling the reader where we've been and where we're going. This can go at the start or the end of a section. You might use language like this. I have argued that, blah, 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 and in the next section, I will present several implications. See, it points both forward and backwards. Things philosophers tend to value. Aim for a narrow and deep paper, not a broad and shallow one. In other disciplines like law and science, we might think that the more precedents or statistical evidence, the better to establish one's claim. However, in philosophy, we generally aren't interested in this kind of weight of evidence argument. For example, we're not interested in all the possible defenses of a position, just the best one. I remember an undergraduate student handing in an essay, the bulk of which was 5 objections to Peter Singer's preference utilitarianism. The student's essay would have been stronger had it focused on the main 2 objections that they thought needed to be considered and spent more time on responding to the ways Singer might have responded. The same goes for a stepwise argument. If there are 4 premises and a conclusion in an argument, focus on the 1 or 2 most important ones while giving a brief account of the others. Consider other people's points of views. Other people here might be a particular philosopher or a defender of a particular view or an imagined interlocutor. There are several reasons to consider other people's points of views. By responding to other people's points of views, you can show that you've synthesized the course material. It allows you to evaluate a view, potentially even your own, in relation to others. And it's what we do when we speak to each other. We say, I see the reasons that you think that, but I don't think you're right for this, that, and the other reason. As with the way we talk out there in the wild, try to be generous with the way you approach your interlocutors in this case. And responding to others' views can show how our view differs from other views out there. It distinguishes one view from another. This can be done in a formalized way through the to and fro of objections, challenges, and worries. And you might even find this in your essay or paper prompt. Defend your view in relation to one possible objection. In this case, you might use language like this. One may object, worry, complain that, or a possible objection, challenge, complain is that. Or when you want to attribute it to somebody, Mills objects, worries, complains that. But you also might do this in a less formalized way. For example, I will argue against Regan's view that animals are direct holders of rights by showing that it rests on an ambiguity. Nevertheless, Regan's view is insightful because it does justice to X, Y, and Z. We consider why someone might want to hold Regan's view. I'm stuck. Talk, walk, and write. This is what I suggest when you're stuck. So there are many approaches to the problem of getting stuck in a paper. In philosophy, I often think that writing problems are thinking problems. We can't write down our ideas because our thoughts aren't clear enough to render onto paper. I want to suggest 3 things that you can do if this is the case. Talk. If you don't know what to say, find a friend, a family member, a tutor, and give them a short explanation of the ideas that you're working on. In the process of explaining, you'll come to think about different ideas that need to be explicated within it. And your interlocutor might ask interesting questions that might get your paper going. Philosophy, I think, is best practiced in dialogue with other people, so waiting at a desk for inspiration is not going to be a great approach. Walk. For most of us, thinking isn't best done at a computer. So get out there and go for a walk. You'll be amazed at the insights that come to you while going for a walk, sitting on the toilet, making a snack. Importantly here, you need to make room for these moments. Right, but of course you have to write a paper. Often we don't know what we want to say, but in a philosophy paper, there are often a few core principles or terms or concepts that need to be explained. So regardless of what you end up saying, these elements are going to need to be in your paper. If you can identify them, this is a good place to start. After you start writing them down, you'll find that you have ideas that come to you about that particular issue. Summing up, at the beginning of this video, I promised to give you some tips concerning doing the job of essay writing well. Tips on how to write a philosophy paper. I gave you 12 tips broken up into big picture, detail and style, structure, things philosophers tend to value, and what happens when you're stuck. These tips aren't an exhaustive list. I encourage you to look for other information out there. But if you implement some of these tips, I think you'll see that your philosophical writing will improve. I've attached a checklist in the link below, and I genuinely look forward to reading your ideas in your papers.